Hey there, students. Tom Richey here with the Bill of Rights Institute, and we are live for another APUSH Prep webinar, and this is our 5th of 9 webinars. Now, the nice thing is here, we've taken a few days off, but we are back every evening before the exam, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That's going to be tonight, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, all the way up to the evening before the exam. So we're going to be here every evening. This evening's review is going to focus on the antebellum period, specifically with questions you have about the era of Jacksonian democracy and or antebellum reform. So go ahead and let us know what's on your mind, and we will go ahead and get started. Okay. So one thing that I want to do first of all, let's go ahead and make sure that y'all have my DBQ about the effects of democracy. Okay. And anytime you have a DBQ, remember that it's going to come from the things in the course and exam description. And so what we want to note on that is that, the things that, when you see documents, they're always going to be helpful for forming arguments that could come about from the course and exam description. And so when we're thinking about democracy, one of the things that we want to think about is going to be the effects of democracy. What happened in terms of, let's see, so that is effects of democracy. Sorry, I sent a link and forgot to label it. So my effects of democracy DBQ will be added to the chat and later to the description of this video. And this is something that I think is worth going over and thinking about what are the consequences? So first of all, what was, so-called Jacksonian democracy, and what are the consequences of this? Now, one of the first things that we need to understand is a lot of us may think, we're told when we're younger that the Constitutional Convention was the beginning of American democracy. And what we have to think about here is that's not really a defensible argument in terms of thinking about that the framers of the Constitution, the participants of the Constitutional Convention, meant to set up a government that was democratic. When we think about what is a democratic government, that is a government where everyone can vote, okay? A government where everyone can vote, or at least, in terms of Jacksonian democracy, that there was equality in voting for all white males. Now, of course, our feelings about democracy now have changed with the 15th Amendment, which prohibits the discrimination in voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, and the 19th Amendment, which prohibits voting discrimination based on sex. Okay, so as far as that goes, we want to think about, what was, okay, so first of all, what was Jacksonian? We think about that in quotes, Jacksonian democracy. Okay, so this is, basically the principle here is in the 1820s. Okay, so the 1820s, most states transitioned from requiring property. Okay, so requiring property in order to vote to allowing all white males to vote, regardless of property ownership. Okay, so as far as that goes, that's something that we're seeing here, and we want to think about what does that mean? How does it change American politics? So one nice place to start here, I don't know how nice this place is, but let's go back to 1824 and let's think about the corrupt bargain. Okay, the corrupt bargain, which is probably one of the more credible conspiracy theories in the history of the United States. When we go to the corrupt bargain, what we're thinking of here is that, you have this contested election of 1824. And in this contested election of 1824, we see that nobody got a majority in the Electoral College. Now, constitutionally, in order to win a presidential election, then somebody has to get a majority of the electoral college. Now, remember that the popular vote, according to our Constitution, is really irrelevant. It has nothing to do with who wins a presidential election. As you note, our most recent presidential election, the winner of the election did not win the official popular vote tally. And so, with that, we see that the electoral vote is what matters based on the Constitution. And what we see here when we're looking at the election of 1824 is, you see a lot of blue on this map indicating Andrew Jackson. Okay, so Jackson, what we can note here is you had 4 candidates for the presidency. You had Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. The main ones you need to know are Jackson and Adams. Now, of course, you need to know Clay as well because of his role here. Now, when we look at this, Jackson got 43% of the popular vote. Then he got, let's see here. I did slides weird at this time. Don't do slides like this. I've got 2 things on the same slide. That shouldn't be the case. Okay. So yes, the electoral vote, 99 electoral votes for Andrew Jackson compared to 84 for John Quincy Adams. Now, you note here 37 for Clay, 41 for Crawford. And so what you're seeing here is that, Jackson is by far the most popular. Now, when I say that, when you look at John Quincy Adams, most of his support comes from the Northeast. Henry Clay's obviously a west of the Appalachian Mountains candidate, and then Crawford is a Southern candidate. And you can see here where Jackson is getting states all the way from New Jersey to Pennsylvania to Mississippi to Indiana to South Carolina. Of course, he's going to run afoul South Carolina later on. But what we see here is that if we were to say which one of these is the choice of the people, okay, that it looks like Andrew Jackson. Now, then again, he did not win the majority either of the electoral vote or the popular vote. And so what we see here in 1825 is when there is not a decisive winner in the electoral college, when one candidate does not get a majority, it goes to the House of Representatives where every state delegation casts 1 vote. And what you see here is there seems to be a correlation between states that cast their votes. Of course, when we look here, John Quincy Adams, the Northeast is going to go with John Quincy Adams. Then you're going to see here that these states that were won by Henry Clay. So we look at Ohio, Kentucky, and Missouri. Excuse me. Well, Ohio, Kentucky, Missouri, they suddenly go for Adams. And so when you look at this, you see a lot of states whose people had voted for Andrew Jackson that they end up supporting someone else. And so what we see here is that John Quincy Adams got a very narrow victory in the House of Representatives. So if we looked here, we've got 13 to 7 to 4. And if we were to take one of these, it would be 12 and 12. So by 1 vote, 1 state delegation in the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams becomes the president of the United States. And so when you look at this, you see that in the popular vote and the electoral vote, we see that when Jackson and Crawford are put together in the popular vote, they had 56% of the popular vote. In the electoral vote, the 2 of them put together had a majority. But Clay and Adams are able to make an alliance here, and they are able to give Adams the presidency. Now, we're not done. If it were just that would be one thing. But when we look at this, what happens is that Henry Clay then, once John Quincy Adams becomes the president, Henry Clay is named Secretary of State. Now, what is so significant about this? Now, when you think about this, there are some of you who may be able to name a few cabinet officials. How many cabinet officials do you think you can name? How many of you, just go ahead and put a number in the comments, okay? So how many cabinet officials can you name as far as President Trump's cabinet? So go through there. Think about that. Some of you will say 0, and that's okay because the exam comes, to a close at 1945, right? It's after World War II. So you probably should get a little more informed, but you're not going to need it for your AP exam. Now, when we think about this, those of you who can name like 2 or more cabinet officials, I would guess that one of those officials would be Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Okay, that would be somebody that I would imagine that some of you could, if you can do anything. Okay, we see here that Oliver's saying I can name 0. Okay, so Bethany, you're saying you can name 3. James, you can name 2. Y'all tell me, was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo one of those or not? Because typically, now, of course, President Trump has had 2 secretaries of state, but typically a Secretary of State is someone who can, Eric, what's up, Eric? All right, so we see here, William Barr is, is the Attorney General, who is definitely somebody who's been in the news. And of course, Ben Carson, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and Rick Perry, the Secretary, I believe, is the Secretary of Energy, if I'm not mistaken. Ben Carson and Rick Perry have in the past been presidential candidates. Rick Perry was the governor of Texas for a long time, a very large state. So with that, what we want to understand is at that time, the Secretary of State was someone who who was basically the next in line for the presidency. Still a very important cabinet post today. Okay, still a very important cabinet post today. But back then, what we want to note is that we have here that every previous president, besides George Washington, who of course was first, every previous president had either been vice president, secretary of state, or both. Okay, Thomas Jefferson did secretary of state, vice president, and going to the presidency there. So what happens here is the Virginia dynasty. You had Jefferson passes to Madison. Madison passes to Monroe. Now, Monroe, during the era of good feelings, what we want to understand here is that James Monroe is president during the era of good feelings. And James, you have asked, did the Constitution anticipate political parties? No. What we want to think about is that the United States, our form of government today, is classified as a democratic republic. Now, our government was not, at the time the Constitution was written, you would not have classified it as a democratic republic. It was more of an aristocratic republic. And they thought that we're not going to have a party system, okay? They're not going to have a party system. And this is something that is, that is kind of idealistic, because when we think about a republic, we're all in this together and we are trying to do things for the common good. That is the idea of a republic, is for the common good, that we all work together. It's democracy where we really get into political parties, because democracy is inherently adversarial and thinking in terms of, that this side versus this side. And so as far as that goes, that's democracy. And so, the framers of the Constitution did not intend to create a democracy. And so that's where we're seeing a difference here in, the type of government, which today we take democracy for granted. And so just to note kind of what's going on here, that the corrupt bargain in an aristocracy, it is not necessarily, against the rules for people to make deals. Okay, so for aristocrats to make deals, that's not necessarily against the rules. So, Clay and Adams, there was no written contract here that Clay and Adams are going to conspire, but it certainly looks like a conspiracy. And 4 years later, Andrew Jackson comes back. Okay, Andrew Jackson comes back and and said, like, basically, there's been a corrupt bargain. I'm the man of the people. And Adams and Clay stole the presidency. And Jackson uses that narrative, as conspiratorial as it is. It's something that played well with the people. And that is an effect. Like, when we're thinking about the effects of democracy, one of those is the advent of popular campaigning. If you had asked Thomas Jefferson, are you running for president? Thomas Jefferson would have said something to the effect of, if the American people want me to be president, I will serve. In Jefferson's generation, it was seen as unbecoming for a gentleman to seek office, that someone should be chosen. Now, behind closed doors, does Jefferson want to be president? Is he seeking the presidency? You bet he is. But he's not out there campaigning for it. So Andrew Jackson is somebody who is openly campaigning for the presidency. Now, another thing we want to note about Andrew Jackson is, here's a guy that was literally born in a log cabin. Okay. So Jackson was born in a log cabin. Jackson was not somebody who came from any kind of aristocratic background. Okay. So that's something that we want to note specifically about Jackson, is we see that Jackson, one of the reasons why we call it Jacksonian democracy is because, Jackson sort of personifies this whole idea of somebody who can be born in a log cabin and become president. Now, one thing we want to note here is, of course, democracy really reaches its maturity in 1840, because the Whigs during this time are constantly a minority party. That there's really only one time. Okay, so after the 1840 election, the 2-year period. Okay, so let me just share something here. So, in 1840, the Whigs, who really were not as democratic as the Jacksonians, basically the Jacksonians take on this name of, we are the Democratic Republicans, and later on they just shorten it. They say, okay, we're just the Democrats. And of course, the National Republicans, Clay and Adams and that bunch, they decide to call themselves the Whigs. Now, the thing about this is, the Whigs, why does the Whig Party call themselves the Whig Party? And so one thing that we see is an effect of democracy. One thing that we see, so when we think about effects of democracy, we're going to put that in our Google Docs. We see here, first of all, that there is popular campaigning. Okay, so popular campaigning. So, and I'm going off on a few tangents here, but the 1840 election I was talking about, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, that they made it look like William Henry Harrison, who was the general that was at the Battle of Tippecanoe, they made it look like he was born in a log cabin, like he was Andrew Jackson. William Henry Harrison was not born in a log cabin. Okay, so just to note that. Okay, so what I want to do here, let's see, King Andrew the First cartoon. Okay, we want to take a look at the King Andrew the First cartoon. So why did the Whigs call themselves the Whigs? And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you a little something. This cartoon that some of y'all have probably seen either in class or in your textbook. Why did they call them the Whigs? Okay, now the Whigs were a political party at that time in Britain, and they were the party that was, the party of more, kind of a more progressive party. That the Tory party was the more conservative, like landowning party, and so the Whigs are calling themselves this. Why would they name themselves after a British political party? Well, they did this because they said that Andrew Jackson is governing like a king. Andrew Jackson is like a monarch. And so going from there, we see here that there is, let's see, I'm trying to get a nice view of this. All right, so born to command, it says here. Now notice he's holding the veto. Okay, so, had I been consulted, of veto memory. Now note here, he's holding the veto, he's got a crown on his head, and he is stepping on the Constitution of the United States. At the same time, he is stepping on internal improvements and the Bank of the United States, which, remember that these are two of the three parts of Henry Clay's American system. Okay, so Henry Clay's American system, what we want to note here is that the American system is Clay's economic policy, which is made up of the National Bank, internal improvements, and the protective tariff. Now, you see here that this is a Whig point of view here, because of course, from the Democrats' point of view, the national bank is not in the Constitution. Internal improvements are not in the Constitution. So Congress passed something for the Maysville Road to basically build a road in the state of Kentucky. Andrew Jackson says the Maysville Road is, is in one state. That is the job of Kentucky to build a road there. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that the federal government should get involved in internal improvements. So we do want to note at this time, Henry Clay's American system. We'll come back to our list there, but Henry Clay's American system. So we see here NIP, okay, National Bank, internal improvements, and a protective tariff. I would very much I would very much encourage NIP, because with that, if you said PIN, the only problem with PIN is that could be PEN or PIN, but NIP only says NIP. Now, INP or P&I, those don't make any sense. Okay, so we won't do that. But we'll note here that the Whigs were the advocates of the American system. And Henry Clay's American system, we think about the goal of the American system. Okay, so the goal was to create an independent, so basically to create an economy after, so to create an economy that was independent of Europe. Okay, so basically, thus the American system. Now, when we think about the context of Henry Clay's American system, we want to note the War of 1812. Henry Clay had been a war hawk during the War of 1812. So the War of 1812 was really a turning point, because it, as we were talking about last time, it basically ends the idea of the United States as a purely agrarian economy, that we are, just focusing our economy only on agriculture and trade. That was the whole Jeffersonian vision for what could be. But Henry Clay wants to see a system where we're promoting domestic manufacturing. We are developing the West. Okay, so that's where the federal government, like Kentucky, the way Henry Clay sees it, if the federal government builds a road in Kentucky, that helps commerce. Okay, but Jackson's like, nope, I don't see it. And so what we want to note here is as we get into the second two-party system, okay, which I've shared this PowerPoint on Jacksonian democracy, and let's think in terms of the second two-party system. So as far as that goes, we see here that you've got the first party system, the Federalists and the Republicans. The Republicans we call either Jeffersonian Republicans or Democratic Republicans, depending. Now, this exam, since it's been redesigned, I think tends to say Democratic Republicans. I prefer Jeffersonian. I think it's a little more accurate. Here's why. Because in 1816 to 1824, it's basically just one party. Everybody is a Republican. So you have, because we believe in a Republican form of government. Now, then they start to break up, around the election of 1828. We see that, these alliances form, these political alliances form with, based on, Clay and Jackson. And so you see the National Republicans and the Democratic Republicans, which the Democrats end up just shortening to Democrats. And that is the same Democratic Party that exists today. And then the National Republicans start to call themselves the Whigs. Okay, so you see in the 1832 election with Clay versus Jackson. Okay, so when we look at Clay versus Jackson in the 1832 presidential election, let me just note here the so the King Andrew I cartoon. Okay, so note here, why Whigs? So basically an opposition party to oppose King Andrew I. Okay, so we see here that is just a link to that. Now let's look at the 1832 presidential election. So here we're going to see Andrew Jackson versus Henry Clay. Now note here that Jackson is calling his party the Democratic Party. Clay's party at this time is calling themselves the National Republican Party or the Anti-Jackson Party. So this is something that we see that, Jackson becomes this figure that is, just polarizing. You're either for him or you're against him. And, people have very differing opinions of it. Sounds like somebody else we might know in politics today. So, as far as that goes, when we're thinking about that election, the National Republicans. Now you see where Jackson is taking the majority of the vote here. Now, of course, South Carolinians did not vote that year because of the Nullification Crisis. And then the Anti-Masonic Party. This is a party that got 7.8% of the vote. Now, I've always found the Anti-Masonic Party kind of interesting because when we're thinking about democracy, okay, so the transition of the United States to a democracy, George Washington was somebody who was very active in the Masonic order. And the Masonic order, is something that still exists today. I have friends who are members of the Masonic order. Now, the thing is, what you got to think about is when we're considering like the Masonic order meets behind closed doors, okay? So they have secret meetings. Part of democracy is openness. And so this idea of this order, that's filled with people who tend to have connections, they're meeting in secret. I believe around this time, there was someone who spilled the beans on some Masonic secrets and rituals. And next thing you know, he was found dead, that sort of thing. Okay, so one thing that I would note here is you have this anti-Masonic reaction, and it coincides with the United States developing as a democracy that's supposed to be open and not exclusive and equal. Okay, so that's something that you see here, and that's just kind of an interesting thing here. And you see where Vermont actually, the Anti-Masonic Party comes in first there, but Jackson really cleaned up as far as the Electoral College here. And also note here the 1832 election. Henry Clay had really just kind of a poor record in picking issues. That Henry Clay wanted to make the election of 1832 a referendum on the bank. Now, one thing that we want to note here is when we think about the effects of democracy, we would think about the expansion of presidential power. Okay, so the expansion of expansion. Thank you, Google. And so the expansion of presidential power, when we look at Andrew Jackson and his vetoes, okay, so if we're thinking about presidential vetoes in the United States, something to look at here, okay, so United States presidential vetoes, what we're looking at is that before Andrew Jackson, you have 2, 7, we've got 9 here. Madison vetoed 7, which is a lot. Adams and Jefferson never vetoed anything. So James Madison was quite a vetoer. And then James Monroe vetoed 1. John Quincy Adams never vetoed a bill. And this is something to kind of think about with the, when we think about, of course, William Henry Harrison never vetoed anything, didn't really exactly have time. And so with that, Andrew Jackson vetoed 12 pieces of legislation when you include pocket vetoes. And so with that, we see that that George Washington, George Washington, James Madison, James Monroe, between them, they, 8, 9, 10, and there's Jackson, who's vetoed 12. And so what we see here is the beginning of, when we are studying AP government, one of the things that we learn about the presidency is the way that the presidency operates in our system of government today. We think about, the veto. Okay, so the veto, which makes the president a third house of Congress. Okay, because, it's really what we see now. At first, the veto, of course, the president has that power, but it was something that was used sparingly. For George Washington, for example, his 2 vetoes, it was either unworkable like my Secretary of War said, it's just not going to work. Like, this piece of legislation we're not going to be able to do it. And then the other one was because Washington felt like this was not in the Constitution. This was a violation of the Constitution. It went beyond the government's constitutional authority. Now, Jackson, with his bank veto, of course, this is something that becomes the big issue of the 1832 election. Now, when we look at the second two-party system, we want to keep in mind here that you've got the Whigs and the Democrats. Okay, the Whigs led by Clay, the Democrats led by Jackson. Now, you're going to see that Clay is more Hamiltonian and Jackson is more Jeffersonian. Okay, so Jackson's a states' rights guy generally. Now, nullification, that went a little too far, Jackson says, but generally Jackson was a fan of states' rights, whereas Clay tended to be more nationalistic. When it comes down to it, the Whigs had a more elitist kind of view. Most people who were favoring antebellum reform at that time were active in the Whig Party. So, the Jacksonians, not so much. Now, strict construction of the Constitution like Jefferson, laissez-faire like Jefferson. And so the Whigs tended to be strongest, even though the Whigs were a national party, they were strongest in the Northeast. And you see the South and the West for the Democrats. Now, the big controversy at this time was the American system, national bank, internal improvements, and protective tariff. Now, the Democrats on the protective tariff, I could be a little more nuanced. Northern Democrats tended to support high tariffs because it helped manufacturing, but certainly Democrats in the South, they tended not to be big fans of this, okay, because it's something that the Southern economy was based on agriculture and trade. And so that's what you see here. Now, when Jackson vetoed the bank, Henry Clay said, let's make the 1832 election a referendum on the bank. Okay, so as far as that goes, that's what we're looking at there. And let's go and take our questions. We've got a few questions that have come in. I love questions, and y'all go ahead and bring this in. So now, Democratic Republicans, Isaac, when they talk about it on the exam, the reason I don't like the use of the term Democratic Republicans on the exam is because this is, it best describes Jackson's party around 1828. So if we look at the 1828 election, we see that Jackson's party is referring themselves as the Democratic Republicans. Okay, now, what we want to note here, they start calling themselves the Democrats. Jefferson's party, so on the exam, Jackson's party will just be referred to as the Democratic Party. Jefferson's party will likely be referred to as the Democratic Republican Party. I think Jeffersonian Republican Party just sounds more clear. But that's, just maybe one of many issues where the College Board and I don't necessarily see eye to eye. All right, and so as far as that goes, that when we're thinking about this, when you're thinking about what the so-called imperial presidency, Jackson definitely redefined the presidency. But the other thing we want to note is that Jackson led the party that for most of the antebellum period was the majority party. And so as far as that goes, I've got a video on aristocratic republics and democratic republics. That's something that I would say, let me go ahead and go into YouTube. I'll get you a link here to this video. Okay, so aristocratic republics. Okay, so let me go ahead and I'm going to give you a link to this video. So we're going to do a video link here. And I think that this lecture, actually, let me send a different link here because that'll go to a timestamp that we don't want. So a video link here for my video on aristocratic republics versus democratic republics, and you see what's going on in terms of in terms of the development of democracy. And I do think that the development of democracy is something that we can say that this process, is something that could be seen as a cause of the American Civil War, because this period from 1820 to 1860, we see a big difference in how it, how people are defined. Okay, so we, like how the nation is defined, how we think of things. So when we think about this, we could say that this whole idea, not only of popular campaigning, but let's see, I forgot, every once in a while, I do forget my train of thought, and I'm sorry about that. So with that, let me just go into a few more things here. We do want to talk a little bit about antebellum reform here as well. Oh, I would say that, not only the expansion of presidential power, but when we think of the idea of, debates about the nature of the union. Okay, so debates, the second two-party system. Okay, so the second two-party system. Okay, so Democrats and Whigs. Okay, so that's one of the big effects of democracy, Democrats and Whigs. Now, popular campaigning, when we look at the bank, Jackson said that the bank is not in the Constitution. Okay, it's not a legitimate constitutional power of the government. Now, Jackson in his bank veto actually had some things that he said in terms of, he said that a bank, when Jackson said that just any bank wouldn't necessarily violate the Constitution, but he said that the Bank of the United States, as it was up for recharter in 1832, Jackson believed that that violated the principles of the Constitution. He believed that the bank made rich people richer at the expense of the average person. So remember that the Democratic Party is based on these laissez-faire principles, that the best thing that the government can do to preserve liberty is to get out of the way and let people be free in their actions and let the economy run on its own course. Okay, so that's something that would have been that was important to them. Now, in terms of that as well, let's see here. So for continuity and change over time. Now, as far as that goes, one thing that I will say, Angela, is I think that if I'm doing a CCOT essay, okay, so if I'm writing a CCOT essay, continuity and change over time, what I would say is this is where chronology is important. If we're thinking about causation, we're probably not going to have to keep chronology, but one of the key things that we need to keep in mind with a continuity and change over time essay is that the chronology really matters, because the first paragraph is really, I think, showing how were things at the beginning. So what I would do here, for example, if I'm writing an essay about about the development of democracy during the period between 1820 and 1860. What I would say here is that, Andrew, I would say here that we began the United States, you could contextualize with the Constitutional Convention, and then you could look at the era of good feeling. And so we see here where typically property men have an outsized say in government. Okay, so that's something that is, that's going to be seen as important. But then what I would do here is I would describe the aristocratic republic in the first paragraph, and then I would describe in the second paragraph the democratic republic and the things that are changing, and I would be sure to make those comparisons. So we would say that, we're thinking about the establishment of a democratic republic, looking at the 1840 election, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and how many people voted, okay? That there were in the election of 1820, less than 100,000 popular votes cast. And then we're getting into the millions by 1840. And so this is something that is, that is changing quite a bit. Okay, so, but we want to, in that second paragraph, get into the changes that are happening. Okay, so going with that, let's also note a few things that I'm going to say that when we're getting into the effects of democracy, we want to note here that let's see. So Jackson's use of the veto. Yeah, so the thing is that Jackson's veto, yes, it's an expansion of presidential power. It's an expression of partisan politics. Okay, so we want to understand that this is an expression of partisan politics as well. So, it can expand democracy in the sense that the bank was something that, it passed Congress, but this is the thing where Jackson is probably the first like populist president. Okay, we could say, now we don't want to confound that with the populist party, but we do see that, politicians are campaigning on issues that people care about. Okay, so one thing that we'll note here is manifest destiny. Okay, so manifest destiny is something that is dealing with the United States moving west. Now, when we think about this is the 1844 campaign. Okay, so when we think about popular campaigning, one thing I would note here is Jackson the corrupt bar. Jackson campaigned on the corrupt bargain in 1828. Jackson campaigned against the bank. Okay, so against the Bank of the United States in 1832, and then we see that in 1840, so Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and so the log cabin and hard cider campaign. Okay, now I'm giving you things that you can use as basically examples of popular campaigning. Okay, so when we think about this, the log cabin and hard cider campaign of 1840. Now, this was a Whig campaign. So basically the Whigs have gotten on the stage of democracy. It's like the 1840 campaign kind of represents the Whigs, who, were pretty much just before that a minority party. They get to elect a president because they put together a great campaign. Now, another thing we want to note here is, Polk, campaigned on Texas annexation and Oregon in 1844. Now, one thing that I found that was very interesting, I looked at the 1844 platforms of the Democratic and the Whig parties. And one thing that I thought was super interesting about the platforms for these two parties is the Democratic Party platform said, we support the annexation of Texas. We support, we support Oregon. Okay, so we support the annexation of Texas. We support, Oregon, said the Oregon settlement in our favor, 54-40 or fight, which they didn't go along with. But they still did, settle the Oregon question. And so the Democratic Party said, we favor manifest destiny. The Whig Party, crickets, just nothing. They didn't address Texas. And this is one of those things, like, for example, in South Carolina, I live in a very Republican state in South Carolina. And so if somebody's running for office as a Democrat, for example, they're not necessarily going to be advertising Democrat. Okay, they're going to say, I'm running for office, and they'll kind of keep their party sort of low key. And so when you look at the Whig Party, in 1844, they just stayed silent on the Texas issue. And so Polk's campaign drove home that Texas issue, and Henry Clay and the Whigs were not really, they weren't equipped for that, because the issue of the day was manifest destiny, and the Democrats won on that. I mean, the winner of most elections in a democracy is the campaign, the party that addresses the issues that people care about in that year. And so then we want to note antebellum reform movements. Okay, so when we're thinking about antebellum reform movements, abolitionism, that we get into, then temperance, and women's rights. Okay, so when you're looking at these, I think these are the big three. Okay, now another one you could look at is public education. Public education, prison and asylum reform. And I'm doing these kind of in terms of, the top three are going to be, if you want to know three, not five, I would focus on the top three. Okay, so Horace Mann in Massachusetts. Now, one thing to note about public education as we go forward and we talk about Reconstruction later on, what we want to note about public education is that public education didn't really exist in the South as we know, as we know it until Reconstruction brought that to the South. Okay, so we see that Reconstruction brings it to the South, and there you go. But during the antebellum period, public education was much more common in the Northeast. Okay, so as far as that goes, you see now antebellum reform movements in general. Now, then we also want to note is that the Second Great Awakening is context. Okay, if you've got something about if you've got a DBQ about antebellum reform movements, I would say that the Second Great Awakening would be your best context that you're going to run into. That's going to be something that is that's what is inspiring these antebellum reformers, very highly religious. And so as far as that, abolitionism, remember what abolitionism is abolishing slavery across the United States immediately. Okay, so when we see here abolishing slavery immediately across the United States, so that's abolitionism. Now, our abolitionists that we look at, the William Lloyd Garrison, and he was the publisher of The Liberator. Okay, so he had a newspaper called The Liberator. Now, then there was Frederick Douglass. Okay, so Frederick Douglass, who wrote a narrative on the life of Frederick Douglass. Okay, so an American slave. Okay, so he wrote one of the most popular slave narratives at that time. So abolitionists, you've got Garrison and Douglass. Now, of course, temperance was an effort to ban alcohol. Okay, so alcohol, basically an effort to ban alcohol in the United States. Okay, some success in New England. Okay, so some success in the Northeast. So we want to note here, now the Second Great Awakening is something that is national. That's happening everywhere. Okay, so that was a fully national, that was across the nation. Camp meetings. Okay, so camp meetings were very popular here. And then that is where they basically just get together, they camp out for a few days, and they pitch a tent and they listen to a bunch of hellfire and brimstone revival preaching. And so that's what they're seeing there. Now we have an increase in evangelical. Okay, so evangelical denominations. Okay, so when we come to that, an increase in evangelical denominations, for example, Baptists and Methodists. Okay, and then what you want to note here was, it inspired antebellum reform movements. All right, and so as far as that goes, the temperance movement, you don't really need to know anybody with that. Women's rights, of course, we want to note the Seneca Falls Convention, and that was in 1848 in New York. 1848 New York State. There's actually a song if you search on YouTube for Seneca Falls song, and it's kind of catchy. Like the first line says the year was 1848 in New York State, so it rhymes. Okay, 1848 Seneca Falls, New York. All right, and then we want to note Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Okay, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of the foremost reformers that was looking for women to be able to vote. Now note here that the context of women's rights, we want to think of in terms of that women were very active in the abolitionist and temperance movements. Okay, women were basically, I mean, when you look at the temperance movement, especially, women were very active in that, because this is something that you know, when you look at the statistics, it's really something in terms of the average American at that time, like in the 1840s, drank like 3 times as much alcohol as the average American today. It's really quite an amount, and people were spending their paychecks. You know, a lot of people are violent when they're drunk. So, you know, with that, what we want to understand about public education is public education was most common in the Northeast. Okay, so in the Northeast, didn't, you know, wasn't implemented in the South until Reconstruction. Okay, so we have basically compulsory education. Okay, so compulsory education, and also it was non-sectarian. Okay, now you still typically had like prayer, Bible reading in schools, but it's something that was you know, not controlled by a religious group. Okay, so not controlled by a religious group. That before that, you know, a lot of schools were, you know, were controlled by religious groups. Horace Mann is setting up this public education system. And of course, Dorothea Dix. Okay, Dorothea Dix, who was trying to improve the conditions. Okay, so tried to improve conditions in prisons and asylums. Okay, so that's something that we can, you know, just hopefully that helps you. I'm trying to do some things that kind of outline some things that are going on here, so it's something that you can use possibly as useful notes for your AP exam. If you've just got some things there that are like, okay, cause and effect, I would definitely have some causation stuff in front of me, since you can use open notes. Some things that are talking about, this is the cause of this, that's the cause of that, this was the effect of this, you see? And so as far as that goes, let's see that Isaac, you're asking for the DBQ. Do you need to describe 4 docs? Now, you can't use a document to support an argument if you didn't describe it. Like, you know, if I'm looking at, you know, if I'm thinking, hey, I want document 2 to support this argument, I can't support an argument with a document that I didn't describe. And so that's something that, you know, we need to kind of keep in mind here, that if you didn't describe the document, then you're not going to be able to use it to support an argument. So the support an argument point takes for granted that you have already described the document. It says on the rubric that the standard for supporting an argument is, you know, is something that must exceed the standard for you know, for using the argument. Okay, so or for you know, for just saying that you understand the document. Okay, and one thing that I'll do here is I'll give y'all a link to my APUSH DBQ page. Okay, so APUSH DBQ page, which has some resources on there that I think will help you, including my rubric, a Marco Learning Annotation Guide, a sample response, and a DBQ that I wrote on the American Revolution. Now, what we want to note as well is I've done a couple webinars, which the Bill of Rights Institute may share in the chat, that we did some webinars last month that were addressing the changes to the exam in this current exam format. So that's something that we want to, you know, make sure that y'all are aware of as well. Okay, so with that, let's see, as far as that goes, we've got a few more things here. Yeah, now one thing that I would say here, avoid the top. Yeah, so here's the thing, Robin. One thing that I like to do when I'm thinking about this period is to compare the 1830s and the 1850s, okay? And we'll get into the we're going to get into the 1850s, I guess, next time. And so one thing that I often find helpful is that, you know, the 1830s, okay, let me go ahead and just show my document here in case some of y'all aren't here with me. Let me go into, you know, or people are watching it later. So the 1830s, the 1850s, okay? So we see here that the gag rule, okay? So the gag rule on, you know, no discussion. No discussion of slavery in in Congress. Okay, and then you've also got here that no action on Texas. Okay, 1836 to 1845. Like basically Texas wanted to get into the Union for 9 years and there's no action on that. So in the 1830s that there are still remnants of aristocratic political culture. Okay, so culture that focused on avoiding controversy. Okay, so when we look at the 1850s, we see the maturity of a democratic political culture. Okay, so the maturity of a fully democratic political culture. I don't know if I want to call that mature because gosh, it's when people are beating each other with sticks and stuff like that, killing each other with broadswords out in Kansas. So a fully democratic political culture in which politicians court controversy. Okay, we think about, like, for example, Charles Sumner's crime against Kansas speech. Okay, so when we look at Charles Sumner's crime against Kansas speech, now you can agree or disagree with what Preston Brooks did, but in response, but it was a very inflammatory speech, like a speech that would have never been given in the Senate before that. Now in the 1850s, heated debates over slavery in the West. Okay, so we see that there are heated debates over slavery in the 1850s. And ladies and gentlemen, let me also note that the Bill of Rights Institute, they're going to share a link here. The Bill of Rights Institute is hosting their Constitutional Academy this summer online. This is typically something that people would attend in person, but this is a free event now, the 6th through the 10th of July. It wouldn't hurt you to go and apply for it to find out more about it. They're going to be bringing in political leaders and community leaders, and this is a great way for you to network with people who also want to participate in politics and civic action. So make sure that that you look into that. The Bill of Rights Institute's Constitutional Academy. This is something that it's a free opportunity there. You don't even have to get off your couch. And so with this, the reform movements, I think, are a product of Jacksonian democracy. They're not necessarily they're not all like endorsements of Jacksonian democracy. You think about temperance. Temperance is really, in a lot of ways, kind of an elitist movement that people should not be allowed to buy alcoholic beverages. But it's a product of Jacksonian democracy, basically mass politics. The reform movements are a product of mass politics, if you think about that. But yes, the reform movements would be something that happened even though reformers weren't necessarily fans of Andrew Jackson or of Jacksonian democracy. Immigrants, when we're looking at immigrants, that's in the 1840s, and certainly the market revolution is creating a need for labor, with Irish people coming in and German people to an extent, but most Germans went into the Midwest and farmed. But yeah, Irish people are looking for labor, and of course we've got a nativist so an uptick in nativism in the 1840s and 1850s, because the Irish, they represented the first Catholic wave of immigration. And if I'm remembering correctly, which exam week I don't always remember correctly, but if you go back to the AP Prep webinar number 10, you can see a history. I went over immigration and internal migration. So we did kind of a thematic approach there with immigration and internal migrations. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank y'all very much. Remember that I will be live with the Bill of Rights Institute every evening at 6:30 until the APUSH exam. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you know how to find us. If you are not subscribed, make sure that you are subscribed to the Bill of Rights Institute's YouTube channel. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, best of luck, everyone, on your AP exams. And it's always a pleasure.